Oregon has had a number of serial killers. It's actually a little unnerving at how many serial killers we've had. There's Jerry Brudos, the shoe fetish slayer, responsible for the death of at least 4 people between 1968 and 1969. There's Randall Woodfield, the I-5 killer, who was convicted of 1 murder and suspected in 18 others, whose victim count may be as high as 44 between 1980 and 1981. There's Keith Jesperson, the happy-faced killer, who was convicted of 8 murders, but confessed to 185 between 1990 and 1995. There's Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, who operated in Oregon and Washington between 1982 and 2001, killing 49, but has suspected to kill more of 100 more. And of course, Oregon was home to the most notorious serial killer, Ted Bundy, who operated between 1974 and 1978, killing more than 40 people across California, Colorado, Florida, Idaho, Oregon, Utah, and Washington. It's suspected that his victim count is significantly higher. But there is one who set the stage, one whose crimes went completely unnoticed, one who is linked to so many murders in Oregon, a man who by the standards of 2022 would be considered a sociopath and a narcissist. Standards that did not exist between 1900 and 1938. This man's name is Ray Van Buren Jackson, and he might just be Oregon's first serial killer. But before we dive into this story, I'm going to ask you to lightly knock the dust off the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more Oregon stories and adventures just like this one. Ray Van Buren Jackson was born in 1870. He grew up in Sodaville, Oregon, which is a small farming town in the Willamette Valley just south of Lebanon, Oregon. At birth, he was left-handed, which in the 1800s was considered a defect. His parents and his teachers worked to fix this defect, and they were successful at it. However, it did teach him the ability to mimic other people's handwritings, something that would prove very useful later on in his life. Ray was charming, he was charismatic, he was friendly, he was outgoing, and he was disarming to just about everyone he encountered. He was known by most people as a smooth talker, something else that would prove useful later on in his life. In his late teens, he decided he wanted to be a teacher, something which didn't require a lot of education and mostly relied on the person's own education. He got a teaching certificate and landed his first job in Beaver Creek, Oregon. Beaver Creek is a small community south of the more metropolitan Portland, Oregon. In 1895, Ray watched in horror as his uncle's wagon was hit by a train, killing his uncle and the team of horses instantly. Ray's uncle's head was actually trapped underneath one of the train wheels. Less than a year later, Ray found himself in prison after he forged payment vouchers. He served 2-year sentence at the Oregon State Penitentiary and was released. Shortly after his release in 1898, he found himself in Baker County, Oregon, and was arrested for armed robbery. And he went back to the Oregon State Penitentiary. He would serve 3 more years and was released at the end of 1901. His reputation, however, was completely tarnished. He could not find a job anywhere. In the early 1900s, Oregon was growing. People were coming and they were going and they were traveling between all the towns and cities across the state. It was very difficult to find any location where someone didn't almost immediately recognize Ray Van Buren Jackson. The only place Ray could go where he wasn't instantly shunned was a very small farming and ranching community, a town called Silver Lake in Lake County. Silver Lake was one of those places that you didn't really go to unless you didn't plan on leaving it. For starters, the nearest town is 100 miles away, and the only road in was 100 miles of winding, rocky, old wagon trail. It wasn't the best route you could take. Despite his criminal past, Ray used his previous teaching certificate and became the Silver Lake 1st through 8th grade teacher. Now, you have to keep in mind that in Oregon in the early 1900s, background checks were not a thing. Outside of Portland, very few, if anyone, had a phone, so checking his references would never have happened. And since it had been 5 years since Ray was a teacher, it is doubtful anyone would have remembered him anyway. Teaching jobs paid very little and required very little training outside of what they would normally learn in their own schooling. On top of that, in this small community of Silver Lake, finding a teacher was nearly impossible, and without checking his references, Ray Van Buren Jackson was hired to teach 1st through 8th grade. However, Ray was not the kind of person you want to entrust your kids with. He began calling himself Professor Jackson, and he was a very strict disciplinarian. He wanted his pupils to not only respect him, but to fear the consequences of any disrespect. One day, 2 of his students got into a fistfight on the school grounds. The following day, after all the kids were seated at their desks, Ray walked in, pulled out a Colt single-action revolver and set it on his desk. He then turned to the class and said, "Would anyone like to finish yesterday's scrap?" On another school day, a young student was being disruptive to Roy's lesson, and he picked up a glass inkwell and threw it at the student, narrowly missing the student's head. When the older students would misbehave, Ray would hit them with a buggy whip. He would tell his neighbors he did all these things. He would even brag about it. By all appearances, it seems Ray Van Buren Jackson took pleasure in beating and threatening kids. In the late winter of 1904, a prominent county merchant by the name of John Conn had gone missing. It took searchers 7 weeks to find his well-preserved corpse staged on a small hill near a ranch. At first glance, it appeared that one of the ranch hands had probably killed him. However, the cause of John's death was ruled a suicide. This is despite the fact that it would be really hard to shoot yourself twice and then beat your face until it's a bloody pulp and you are unrecognizable. The morning of John Conn's disappearance, he had breakfast with the area's school teacher, of course, Ray Van Buren Jackson. Ray was actually the last person to see Conn alive. After Conn had gone missing, Ray rushed to the local sheriff and gave his statement about what Conn and he had talked about at breakfast and where he went after breakfast. Then he contacted the local newspaper and gave them a statement. It was as if Ray was trying hard to make sure everyone knew he was the last person to see John Conn alive. Prior to his death, Conn had taken out a $3,000 loan. The money from this loan disappeared along with Conn and was never recovered. Conn's brother actually had to pay back the loan with assets liquidated from his brother's estate. We will never know what happened to that money or why Conn wanted to meet with Ray, a convicted forger who could have easily forged the promissory note and taken the $3,000 without the bank knowing it. We just won't ever know. That was never part of the investigation of Conn's missing. But what we do know is that Ray Van Buren Jackson bought $3,000 worth of cattle almost immediately after Conn disappeared. And there was no chance of him doing that at all on a teacher's salary in rural Oregon in the early 1900s. It just is not possible. Shortly after Conn disappeared, and before his body was found, an 11-year-old student named Zelma Martin was misbehaving at school. Ray demanded that she stay after class to clean the classroom as punishment. This was one of his lesser forms of punishment. She was a younger girl, probably didn't want to beat the hell out of her right away. She arrived home a half hour late and almost immediately dropped dead. Her death was ruled as accidental poisoning. Her parents did keep strychnine in the home, and it was believed that she had eaten some, though the idea of a child eating strychnine on purpose is borderline ludicrous. Strychnine is known to be very, very, very bitter, and she would have had to ingest a large amount to kill her so suddenly. According to her parents, Zelma arrived at home, didn't eat anything, said she wasn't feeling well, went to bed, and died. However, at the schoolhouse, Ray Van Buren Jackson kept arsenic, which is another type of poison. Even a moderate amount of arsenic can take several hours to kill someone. It should also be noted that John Conn's body had not yet been found. It's very likely that John Conn's killer stored his body for several weeks before placing him in the field. If Ray was the killer, the only place he would have had to store the body would be at the schoolhouse. This is total speculation. There's no evidence to prove what I'm saying. However, if Ray had killed John and stored his body at the schoolhouse, the day Zelma Martin stayed after school, she could have seen something and Ray would have had to act. Again, total speculation on my part. No evidence, nothing to back this up, just speculation. In the fall of 1907, a man by the name of Julius Wallende moved to Silver Lake. He wanted to get started as a rancher and a homesteader, and this area was perfect for it. However, one day he would vanish without a trace. Then, 11 weeks later, a letter arrived to the editor's desk of the Portland Oregonian newspaper. The letter gave detailed information on where to find Julius Wallende's body. And sure enough, using the letter's instructions, the body of Julius Wallende was found in a rather artistic pose, frozen in the ice less than half a mile from where John Conn's body was found 3 years earlier. He had been shot twice and his face beaten to an unrecognizable pulp. Then another letter arrived telling authorities where to find the killer. Once a man was arrested, it was discovered that the letter was a ruse and the man would turn out to be innocent. The murder of Julius Wallende would go unsolved. Other than the odd similarities to the Conn killing, there are no real ties between Wallende and Ray Van Buren Jackson. We just have to assume that the same person who killed Conn used almost an identical method to kill Wallende. In 1908, Ray Van Buren Jackson was removed from his position as 1st through 8th grade teacher. It was decided that he no longer fit that position. But this was not for a reason you might think a sadistic disciplinarian would be removed from his position molding young minds. The county decided he was more suited for the role of superintendent for the Lake County School Board. On March 10, 1910, a woman named Emma Dobkins died. Emma was often seen with Ray Van Buren Jackson, and it was believed by many that they were in love. On paper, Emma Dobkins died from angina pectoris, a condition caused by lack of blood flow to the heart. It is incredibly rare for someone in their late 20s to suffer from this disease and die. Now, documentation on Emma's death is incredibly vague. Many of her friends said that she committed suicide after a tainted relationship with Ray Van Buren Jackson, who was a close friend of Emma's brother. Ray was known as a bit of a cad and would often be seen with various women, married or not. Other members of the Lake County community said she was pregnant with Ray Van Buren Jackson's child at the time of her death. Since the documentation on Emma's death is so vague, it's hard to tell what role Jackson could have played in her death. It's just kind of odd that we had another death where Ray Van Buren Jackson is prominently mentioned as a key player in her life. In 1911, after 3 years as a Lake County superintendent, the temptation got the better of Ray Van Buren Jackson, and he was caught embezzling money, forging his own checks. He was never charged with embezzlement. Instead, he resigned and moved away. He took a number of jobs here and there, including ranch hand, retail business, and even homesteading. None of them really worked out for him, and he continuously moved from place to place for the remainder of his life. This was likely to escape his past criminal activities. It is also likely that he moved so much to avoid getting caught for his forgery schemes, though that is just a speculation. He would eventually move back to Silver Lake. Ed Nichols, Dewey Morris, and Roy Wilson were spending the winter of 1924 at a cabin near Lava Lake, Oregon. They were trapping and keeping the cabin in good condition through the winter. In the spring of 1924, the bodies of all three men were found floating in the lake. They had been beaten and shot. One of them actually had their face beaten so much you could not recognize it. This high-profile murder has been unsolved for almost 100 years. The prime suspect of this murder has always been a man named Charles Kimsey. Kimsey had threatened to kill Ed Nichols a year before, but he was never officially charged. However, it is believed that Kimsey could not have worked alone to kill all three men. Before the discovery of the bodies, Kimsey was seen in Portland, Oregon, along with a second unidentified man, selling items that would later be reported missing from the Lava Lake cabin. Based on witness statements who described the second man, it is very likely he was a close friend of Kimsey's named Ray Van Buren Jackson. And he and Kimsey were in Portland at the exact same time. If you want to know more about the Lava Lake murders and really get into the reason Jackson is a good suspect, there is a link to the video about it up in the right corner. Harold Bradley was the owner of a large and very successful ranch. He had hired a man by the name of Lincoln Hutton, who went by the name Link, as a ranch hand. On December 29, 1929, as Bradley and Link were working on a car, shots rang out. Harold Bradley was shot twice with a .30-30 rifle and died soon after. Link Hutton was accused of the murder. Interestingly enough, the wounds Harold Bradley suffered were not life-threatening, but he was left alone with a neighbor while Link went to go get help. At his trial, the same neighbor of Bradley testified that Link Hutton had come to his house and confessed to killing Bradley. The jury did not believe his testimony. There was, as best as can be told, some serious timeline irregularities in the testimony. That, along with other irregularities, would get Link Hutton acquitted of all charges. The murder of Harold Bradley would go unsolved. The neighbor who was left alone with Bradley and who testified against Link, saying that Link confessed to him, was none other than Ray Van Buren Jackson. Even more interestingly, Ray Van Buren Jackson was having an affair with Harold Bradley's wife. Just 4 months after Harold Bradley was killed, on May 1st, 1930, Ira Bradley, Harold Bradley's father, was beaten to death with the butt of a Colt revolver at his ranch in Lake County. Much like John Conn and Julius Wallende, Harold's face was unrecognizable. The killer left the gun used in the beating at a neighbor's house, successfully getting that neighbor accused of the murder. However, that neighbor had a solid alibi. He had been in the town of Silver Lake, only 25 miles away, buying a new Ford. Fortunately, Ira's body was found by another neighbor who, in a moment of panic, forgot where he lived. And he called the Harney County authorities, who came out, looked at the crime scene, and then took possession of Ira's body and transported it to Burns, Oregon, which was almost 100 miles away. Unfortunately, the crime happened in Lake County. After the police in Harney County realized the massive error, the crime scene was turned over to Lake County police, but too much foot traffic around the scene had destroyed all physical evidence. And the neighbor, who just so happened to be the first one on the scene and was able to help out so much by calling the wrong county, was, that's right, Ray Van Buren Jackson. On February 1st, 1938, in Silver Lake, Oregon, a single shot rang out. It came from the upstairs of a house. Police entered the home and found the dead body of Ray Van Buren Jackson. Near his body was a .30-30 rifle, the same caliber used to kill Harold Bradley. Ray Van Buren Jackson's death was ruled a suicide, though the method was a little bit odd. Instead of shooting himself in the head, through the mouth, or under the chin, as most people would likely do with a long gun, Ray Van Buren Jackson put the gun against his own chest and would, according to police records, use a fire poker to pull the trigger. This is not incredibly unlikely, and there were no reports of anyone entering the residence or leaving the residence after the gunshot was heard. Nor could I find any reports of any known enemies of Ray Van Buren Jackson, though I do suspect there probably were a few. Ray Van Buren Jackson was never arrested for murder. He was never a suspect in any of these deaths. Either he was absolutely Oregon's first serial killer, or he was the most unlucky man who was consistently in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm curious about your thoughts. Was Ray Van Jackson Buren a serial killer here in Oregon, or was he just a bad luck guy? Leave me a comment, let me know. I'm very curious. I've given you as much information as I could. There's a lot more, but this video will be very, very long if I gave it all. Alright, thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button. I will see you next time for something else. I don't know what. Possibly anything.